I'll turn to the next presenter, the presenter formerly known as the second presenter, but now the third presenter, Dr. Elisabeth Moyer from the University of Chicago. Elisabeth is an associate professor in the Department of Geophysical Sciences and the director of the university's Center for Robust Decision-Making on Climate and Energy Policy.
Okay, you guys can see this, the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm the last person speaking today, and I'm going to be the most different person speaking because this project has nothing to do with data science in the way that you guys have been talking. I do work with machine learning for climate studies. This project is something totally different, but I think it's relevant and I think it's interesting, and presumably Kyle thought it was too for asking me here. So I'm talking about two projects that were undertaken by members of our group, the Center for Robust Decision Making on Climate and Energy Policy. We're collectively calling them Infrastructure Constraints on Energy Transitions. These projects were motivated, These projects were motivated by two questions about potential future energy transitions. We wanted to know, how has the US energy system changed in the past? If we're going to make a transition in the future, we should certainly use the 200 years of past history to try to inform us about what it takes to cause an energy transition, how fast it occurs, and what the constraints are. So the US has a really amazing history because we transitioned from wood to coal quite late. So we have a very intense, high-paced series of transitions that occurred in our history at a time when our government was documenting pretty much everything. We have probably the best documented industry of any country in the world because the US Census Bureau got going quite quickly after the revolution. So we have fairly decent records, and we can therefore construct a reasonable history across all of these transitions. The second question we wanted to address is what infrastructure would need to be changed to produce an energy transition now. So as you all know, everybody in this room knows that energy is, the energy sector is very capital intensive and involves long-lived infrastructure. So the pace and timing of a future transition is obviously constrained or affected by the amount of infrastructure required to be built, and the cost is likely affected by the amount of infrastructure required to be thrown away. So discarding anything before its service life is over, some sort of lost revenue for somebody. And even if you say, like the economists say, this doesn't matter to us, it certainly matters to whoever owns that infrastructure. And in general, once you have a historical perspective, you realize it's taken us 100 years to build up the system that keeps us all powered today, that powers our whole economy. We can't necessarily project a few transition that will happen in a decade. So again, we need to try to understand what is the sort of sunk cost and the investment required to support the flow of energy that powers our economy today. Okay, two different projects, both the research was led by two young researchers. Robert Suits on the top here is a young historian. Xin-Yi Chen is an engineer. In both cases, the data set is now fully available on animation. So the top project's actually been submitted to a journal. The bottom one is not yet, but the animation is visible, and I'm going to show you hopefully both of those on screen so you can see how we presented the data, and also the documentation for each one is online. The data is available on request. Okay, so like I said, this is not a project about data science. Both of these projects involve archival research, which nobody has talked about. No one in this entire session has said, and then I went to the library and looked at documents. But that's basically what both of these projects involve. So for the first one, we wanted to know every single energy flow through history. So we need to know how much wood, coal, and charcoal is used for making bricks in 1820. We have to figure that out because that's part of the energy flows. The second project, we literally wanted to count every piece of infrastructure that was long-lived in the United States. And of course, we benchmarked, our actual data is benchmarked in 2012 because that's when we started this project. We finished it basically this year. So now we have to write an epilogue for what changed between 2012 and now. You can see on this page just some of the tables produced, some of the ways we develop a cost estimate. How do you make a proxy for historical data? How do you, benchmark a cost of a natural gas processing plant? Each one of these estimates requires, archival research in order to come up with something plausible. Okay, so I'm going to start with a history project, and I'm going to start with a motivating slide. So this was one of the reasons I got so interested in history, is the well known, or at least reasonably well known, fact that the United States has an abnormally high energy intensity in the past. So that means the power use of the United States per GDP produced. So if you typically would benchmark that as dollars per joule, joules per dollar, depending on what, whether you look at it, which way you look at it. We require more energy to produce a given unit of value, or certainly we did in the past, by certain grotesque amounts. And so on the left-hand side here, I'm showing you our historical data set, although there have been other estimates of primary source energy that are fairly similar. And so on the x-axis here is power use per capita in thousands of watts. On the y-axis is GDP per capita in thousands of US dollars. The two dashed lines here are $4 and $12 per year per watt. So the higher up on this graph, the higher on the y-axis you are, the better your country is at producing value per unit of power used. And you can see that most countries fall pretty tightly, and there's a limited selection here. And if you go to our paper, you can see which ones we excluded. But this is a fairly significant chunk of countries. The gray ones are all from the World Bank. The orange one is a historical projection of the Netherlands back to 1815. And through this entire period across history, each of the gray countries has its most recent data from the World Bank, and then this long gray tail is its historical data that typically goes back to the 80s in World Bank databases. Most countries fall within this band of $4 and $12 per year per watt. And then we have the United States out in blue being all lonesome by itself, doing something completely different. So in the early United States history, we used enormous amounts of energy per dollars of GDP produced. And this is important for us to understand, in part because some people have projected these trends into the future. And so we certainly want to understand why these trends exist. And again, if you go to our paper, you can see we flagged a couple important dates here. There's lots of interesting things that happen. You can see the historical happenings in the slope and the trajectory of this energy intensity. So on the right, we're just plotting the ratio here of GDP per power use, or in this case, we're doing power use per GDP, so we're in megajoules per dollar. And you can see again that the United States looks like it's been improving sufficiency over time. Basically, it's been coming back to the normal range now. So in this graph, the only countries that exceed at present the United States for energy intensity are Nepal and Haiti. So that's not a great company to be keeping. If we included more, like I've excluded the major energy producers, so we're actually in the same boat as Canada, but still, it's not a great look. Okay, so the best way to show you how our data is presented is actually just to show it to you. And so I'm going to see if I can get myself to shift this. So this is our history project, and it should be up for you to see. And so what this is a Sankey diagram. And so you guys are probably familiar with the Sankey diagram. The flow of energy through the economy is represented as a line graph. On the left, you have the primary energy inputs. On the right, you have the end uses. The width of the line is proportional to the flow. And we're showing you per capita energy use here, so it'll be in watts per capita. And so we're starting at 1800. This is new data. No one has ever done the right-hand side of this diagram before. They've done the left-hand side kind of, but not the right-hand side. So we've now redone every single line on this graph as a research project. We have a timeline on the bottom. I'm going to start the animation. You'll see the little tick mark going along, and up top here, you'll see the date, and you'll see the energy use per capita, the primary energy use per capita. So the other innovation here for people who are used to Sankey diagrams, we're going to bookkeep all of the waste heat of electricity generation instead of having it suddenly vanish into nothing, which is like many Sankeys do that. We're going to allocate it to whatever sectors are using electricity. So that means that the total energy on the primary energy inputs and the end uses will be identical. So we're doing full accounting, full cost accounting of energy. And so you'll see the electricity line to every sector will have a line for electricity and a line for the waste heat. And again, we're looking at residential, commercial, agricultural, industrial, and transportation. The graph on the bottom is going to be static. This is just a stack bar graph that shows you the energy use per capita, and we can switch it. We have different options, so we can switch and show you total, fractional, per capita. We can show it to you by fuel or by sector. And so you immediately see why we have such high energy intensity, or at least something that tells you a hint about why we have such high energy intensity in the past, is because in 1800, there's nothing going on in the United States except for residential consumption. Even agriculture is tiny. We're nothing but a country of sort of farmers who burn huge amounts of wood in their fireplaces. So the per capita energy consumption in 1800 is 3 times the amount of our contemporaries in Europe, and all of it is residential wood consumption for heating. So we took over the country, we had free wood, people built really terrible houses, and historians argue over why that is, and there's nothing interesting that happens with energy consumption until after the Civil War. So here I'm going to start the animation. You'll see it looks very, very boring until we get to 1865 and afterwards. So the reason it's so dull, even though we have coal mines in Pennsylvania, is because there's no way of moving coal around. There's really nothing you can do. We have no midstream infrastructure. Only now, after 1865, we suddenly start getting something happening, and that's because the railroads go out after the Civil War, mostly government subsidized, so huge effort here. So now you can see us expanding. We're about to get to the Great Depression. You should see a dip then in 29. Bang, there's the depression. And then you'll see the great expulsion of coal from all the sectors. Coal gets driven out very quickly in the 40s and 50s from every single sector. Here's the growth of the electric sector, and we're about to come on to fracking, and we'll see the revolution. So watch the electricity box here as fracking comes in. Look what happens to the coal line. There we go, boom. That's what fracking does for you. It pushes out coal, brings in gas. So anyway, this is a fully interactive graphic. You can slide it, you can pull it, you can look at anything you want. You can go, we have particular historical milestones here, so you can go to things that we've identified as interesting. These are either new technological developments. You can see a lot of stuff happens in the the 60s and 70s. Some of that is legislation. So here's the National Energy Act of 1978. Somewhere in here, here's the OPEC crisis. Here's the great Northeast blackout that led to the formation of NERC in 1965. And again, we want feedback. So if any of you guys say, hey, my industry has a great milestone you didn't include, why isn't it there? We got room in the milestones, we can add it. Yes, okay. So here is a stacked bar graph of the timeline that you just saw. So on the top, we have the per capita energy usage by fuel, and on the bottom we have it by sector. And you can see that the industry and transportation sectors can't really grow. They just don't functionally exist until after the Civil War. So the great blossoming of the US economy and the great expansion of energy use happens only when you have some sort of supply infrastructure. That's kind of a key lesson. You also see something which is quite relevant. Here, let me just put this into full screen mode. That no one apparently has pointed out before, which is that the OPEC crisis of 1973 has an analog in the coal crisis of 1918, and both of them led to long-term changes in the energy intensity economy and to long-term changes in the per capita use of a fuel. And so the coal crisis of the 1910s is actually fascinating because if you think about the sectoral uses of coal, you realize that this is the evolution of coal. Coal basically has been declining. So the blue line here is the railroad, the growth of railroad tracks. So you can see that coal's rise really follows the expansion of the infrastructure to supply it. It goes through its sort of OPEC-like crisis in the 1910s, and then it crashes. And had it not been for the growth of the electric sector, coal would be essentially gone. So this long-term decline here, the last use of coal in anything other than the electric sector is just in industry for the very declining remnants of American steelmaking from war, right? That's the only thing you really need coal for anymore. So the only use for coal is in the electric sector. And what you see here in the last bit, the last year, so since about 2005, there's been a decline in coal usage by half in per capita coal usage, which is just because of the substitution of natural gas for coal. That's the effect of the fracking revolution. So when people talk about energy transitions and can we go through one in the future, our answer is we're going through one now. This is an energy transition that we're in. So we made a mathematical definition of an energy transition. We looked in history. This is all in our paper, so I won't go over it too long because you can read the paper. But we identify 9 different sectoral transitions. which is, in our definition, is a fuel falling from 70% to 30% of its peak share. And you can see that in the electric sector, which is this bottom plot, and here we're not showing the primary energy in, we're showing the fraction of electricity produced by each fuel so that we're more fair to the renewables. We have been in an energy transition since 2012. Classical, it's just like any other transition, just like wood to coal, just like coal to petroleum. There's nothing different about it. What we're experiencing now is an event that's comparable in its magnitude, scope, and importance to historical energy transitions. So that's something to think about also for the future. You know, this is a big event, it's historical, but it's not changing our lives dramatically. The industry obviously is deeply affected by it, but the average consumer doesn't really notice. And so one of our arguments is, you know, there's some hope that a future energy transition is not socially disruptive, because we're in one right now and most people don't even realize it. Anyway, I encourage everybody, people are deep experts here. We'd love to get your feedback on this documentation. There's like 60 pages of back-end documentation and a fairly short front end. Okay, so now to the very quickly through our next project, which is the physical inventory of the energy system, also arose out of wanting to understand infrastructure constraints. And we decided we were just going to count every piece of infrastructure in the US, where it was, what it was, and how much it was worth. And we were going to compute the total replacement cost of the US energy system. And this impetus for this came from a bunch of conversations with economists where I claimed that the value of long-lived infrastructure was going to be comparable to a GDP. And they said, no, it can't possibly be that much. And I said, the stuff is long, it's 50-year lifetime. You know, the energy sector is 7% of US GDP. If we spend 2% of GDP per year on replacing infrastructure and it's got a 50-year lifetime, that's a GDP. So of course it's comparable in scope to a GDP. And then we spent 7 years working on this, and the answer is it's comparable to a GDP. It's about half. So the total value of U.S. infrastructure is close to $10 trillion. And again, this is 2012, and it's in 2012 dollars. Of that total, 6.4 trillion is exclusive to fossil fuels. 2.2 trillion of that is the electrical grid, with a large chunk of the valuation actually being the distribution system. 1.2 trillion are non-fossil power plants. So this is in 2012. We've had more wind since then, but wind, as you can see, is just minute, right? The total amount of solar, wind, geo, and bio are just essentially almost nothing compared to the cost of the whole system. As you saw on the Sankey also, the renewables are just minute little lines. So most of our system is coal, oil, and gas. So this is our animation. Hopefully this is up now. So what we've done is we've plotted the value, you can see on this, basically we're not using, there's no data science. These are all things that are GIS tagged. We have visualization representations of them from public data sources. This is our valuation number up here. You can see the amount tick up. You can put anything you want on. You can see the coal system and our railroads that transport it. We have 1 million oil and gas wells here. You can watch our electricity system. So you can see the relationship between coal plants and the mines that supply them. So there's wonderful little cases like this little detail here where you have a little railroad connecting a plant and a mine. You can understand where our wind plants are. We have a wind capacity underlay. So you can put on our wind farms and notice where they sit. So lots of fun things to play with. This is our valuation up here. This link goes to our paper that documents that valuation. And again, we'd love to get feedback from you guys. And I know we're at time, so I should stop and take a few questions, but we would be interested in getting feedback on all of these projects.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. And
I'll leave this up in case anyone has questions on it.
So at the top of the list, the energy intensity is single factor productivity, that is energy/GDP. But what about total factor productivity? To what extent are you capturing, I think this is referring to your energy intensity plots, by the way. To what extent are you capturing a more capital intensive economy in the US over time?
So that's not what it's capturing. At least the early historical decline in energy intensity is due completely to the fact that other sectors that are more economically valuable, or at least that are counted in the economy, begin to grow past residential. That's the reason why you get that dramatic change, is because the residential energy sector is a huge energy consumer that doesn't produce what we call value. And that's all that you're showing, right? It's much less deep than people think it is. It means people had really terrible houses and they burned a lot of wood and there wasn't really any industry. That's what you're seeing with that. You know, there's not any deep sort of structural thing that teaches you some great lesson about economics. It teaches you that Americans had terrible houses and lots of cheap wood.
All right, it looks like my cat's moderating with me here. So.
That's totally fine. It's always good to have a cat on. If you don't have a cat on a telecon, it's not a good telecon.
Right. On to the next question. This one's a quick one. Can you say again where we can find the paper, or where can we find the publications around this work?
So on both sites. So just to remind you, neither thing is peer reviewed yet. One has been submitted. It's hopefully will appear in PNAS, but we put it up as a preprint. The other one, we have the back end. So we have 100 pages of documentation that's already available. So you would go to us.sankey.rdcep.org or us.infrastructure.rdcep.org.
Okay.
You can see them up here. You can see us.infrastructure.rdcep.org. Mm-hmm. Or just us.sankey. The Sankey one redirects, but these are the main sites and these are the stable URLs. And in both cases, we have a page about a contact page. We'd really like to have input. We tell you something about the site. We tell you how to reach us. We tell you who we'd like to hear from, which includes, industry professionals. Especially for the infrastructure project, we want to hear if someone says, your evaluation is wrong. Don't you fools, you don't really know what a liquid natural gas terminal costs. And I can tell you that, I have a better number for that. That's what we want to hear. We spent, like I said, a huge amount of time trying to value the electrical distribution system, which is a huge painful thing and something that's not particularly well documented. Transmission, sure, but distribution is hard.
Okay.
So for all of those, we're looking definitely for feedback. We're at that stage.
Okay, excellent. And I'll I guess exercise a little bit of moderator privilege here and throw in a question. So it looked like throughout much of history, we had access to relatively cheap energy. Again, going back to the transitions work, would you say that's the case, that the energy costs in the U.S. have been exceptionally cheap through most of history? Is that why we were able to have such high intensity?
I don't think so necessarily. Certainly the wood was relatively cheap. I'm not an expert on cost, and that is a useful question. I will say that the coal crisis was really set off by almost the same kinds of things that happened in the OPEC crisis, that there was sudden shocks in price. There were restrictions in supply. So people said, I can't get my coal this year. It's expensive. And I think anytime you have supply shocks and price hiking by factors of several, business says, like, let's just figure out a different way, right? And so it just sets the impetus for transitioning away. And people basically hate coal. Coal is solid. It's hard to move around. Every single industry that can get away, or consumer that can get away from using coal, will get away from a solid fuel as soon as they can. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating is how early some particular subsectors got off coal. So steamships were burning fuel oil rather than coal, directly from the 1910s. Mm-hmm. They were still steamers, but they no longer use coal because it's just too much of a pain to move around. To load your ship full of coal, it takes too long. Mm-hmm. So there was a massive national infrastructure project to say, let's figure out how to take our entire marine fleet and get them off coal.
Okay.
So we've been through these transitions before. We've been through big changes, and it's always painful for somebody, right? All transitions involve losers and winners.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thanks for the insights there.
So that's our hope, is that we are more encouraged about making a transition, but we also realize how big it is, how slow it can be, and how dependent it is on infrastructure. So we don't try to make a 5-year plan for decarbonizing or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So I'll do one more question really quick, and to wrap up. So, and I agree with this, definitely corroborate this question. The visuals are incredible ways to tell the story of the energy in the US. How did you go about making those visualizations, and what skills collaborations were required?
You notice that there's this name Madison on both of the author lists. So Nate Madison is a professor in the DePaul University College of Computing and Digital Media. And he is a crazy ex-artist who's also a programming genius. He doesn't even have a PhD, but they hired him as faculty, and he is amazing at these things. So the answer to how to make a great visualization is first you find someone like Nate who can do all kinds of strange things, and then you have to hire a regular programmer to make it stable and to make it keep working. Right. So he would do things and we're like, what in the world is going on in your code? He's like, I don't know, but I just kind of thought of this and it works. So he has a great graphical eye, very creative. But at the end of the day, you're going to need a professional programmer to stabilize it and make it a user-friendly tool. And so for the Sankey case, we brought in like the staff of the University Research Computing Center and said, like, let's operationalize this. It can't just be this rickety, amazing, but fragile system that's built by one crazy professor. But yeah, I can't do this kind of programming. Gotcha. He's the one who's done it, and it's his eye that really helps.
Gotcha. So I appreciate the candid response, and it sounds like the answer is.
Oh, but that's the answer. You need a graphical person. You need someone really clever to make it look different, and then you need someone really professional to make it stable.
Right. So build a great collaboration, find a great person. Easier said than done, but a good strategy nonetheless, I think. So thanks again for the great presentation, Liz. As the last question alluded to, the great visualizations, and everyone, please, wherever you're sitting, thank Liz for coming and presenting. And